Well, hello everyone. My name is Ryan Minook. I'm a solutions consultant here at FileMaker, and we have a fantastic webinar lined up for you today, focusing on how research teams leverage the FileMaker platform. We'll be joined by Platinum FileMaker Business Alliance member Chris Ippolite from iSolutions, as well as Steph Corden from the ALS Never Surrender Foundation, who will share the genesis of their amazing ALS research progression app, as well as its benefits. But before we get started, let's cover a few brief housekeeping notes, followed by a minute or two discussion of the FileMaker platform itself. So for the best experience, it is strongly recommended that you participate in this webinar with at least a broadband connection. If you have any problems or require online assistance at any time, please contact Citrix Technical Support at 888-259-8414. Now, throughout today's presentation, you're going to have the opportunity to type in and ask questions, so let's talk briefly about how to do that. Just go to the control panel, click on the question section, enter your question, and click on send. We'll try to answer as many as time allows at the end of our presentation, but remember, you don't have to wait until then to submit a question. So what is FileMaker? FileMaker is a powerful software platform that allows you to quickly create and deploy custom apps that solve both existing and potentially broken business processes. And to get started building your custom apps, use FileMaker Pro Advanced, which is a desktop software for Mac and Windows. You then upload your custom app to FileMaker Server, an on-premise software application designed to manage, host, and protect those apps that you build. Or you can upload your apps to FileMaker Cloud, which is a cloud offering based on Amazon Web Services technology. And then once your apps are hosted, connect to them via FileMaker Pro for the desktop, FileMaker Go for iOS devices, and WebDirect, a web browser technology for desktop, tablets, and phones, both iOS and non-iOS. Now, the key takeaway here is that the FileMaker platform allows you to rapidly transform your business with custom-built apps and provides the flexibility to streamline your workflow across all of your devices so you can access your data whenever and wherever you need it. And research teams have been leveraging the FileMaker platform for these same benefits for years. So traditionally, archaeologists have relied on paper logs, lugging around hefty binders, sometimes filled with illegible handwriting and sometimes leading to lost papers. And this was the case with the Jericho project, where not only was a lot of time lost to re-entering data, but that data was typically re-entered months away from memories of the initial find. And I'm sure a lot of you in the audience can relate to the pains of having to re-enter data. Well, they now take their iPads with FileMaker Go on location to not only capture data, but they've added a workflow in their custom app to take photos of their sites, drawing quick sketches on top of those photos, and importing it directly back into their custom app. It's really, really cool. So total documentation can now be completed in minutes. Their data is centralized, making it easier to share real information with other researchers. And that time wasted on double entry, that can now be spent on more important tasks like analyzing data from the finds. The Mote Environmental Laboratory for Forensics, they gather information on baleen whales, and they also ran into obstacles collecting data in the field and managing it at home. In this case, their home was thousands of miles away from where data was being collected, and this is especially a problem because internet connectivity is sparse in the Arctic, so data had to be collected and stored offline. Previously, this meant that thousands of physical samples, batches, and analysis were stored in dozens of spreadsheets, often misleading the team on which spreadsheet carried the most recent data. And as I'm sure you can guess, this massive collection of scattered data meant a lot of time on data reentry. So FileMaker provided a central hub to easily manage and share an unlimited amount of data and documents. It's used to run queries in multiple ways across different data sets for clear reporting. And just like the Jericho project, FileMaker Go was used offline to facilitate a better workflow out in the field. FileMaker is also used to generate, print, and scan barcodes for their physical inventory, which aids in tracking batches, samples, standards, and more. So these are just two quick examples of how research teams have leveraged the FileMaker platform, resulting in improved mobility with better efficiency and productivity. But now, allow me to take a step back and introduce Chris Ippolite from iSolutions to lead us into our spotlight of Steph Corden and the fantastic ALS research progression app. Chris?
Thanks, Ryan. And today in our FileMaker in Support of Research Teams webinar, we're going to be looking at a FileMaker custom app that was created to significantly improve ALS research data collection. And before we get to that, I'd like to introduce you all to someone that I've had the pleasure of working with, Steph Corden from the ALS Never Surrender Foundation. And Steph has a very powerful story that he's going to share with us today. Steph, before we get started with the story, can you tell us a little bit about yourself professionally, personally?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. My name is Steph Gordon, and I've been in the data analytics and data warehousing space for about 25 years, working for a number of different software companies, including 8 years running a consulting firm, and also a avid mountain biker, snowboarder, and horse wrangler. And ironically, a lot of the folks that I've met during my ALS journey have also been very active individuals. Even though there's probably a stigmatism or stereotype with ALS that it happens to older individuals, I've met quite a few folks that are same as myself, in their late 30s to mid 40s when they were diagnosed.
Thanks, Steph. And then, of course, in 2013, your life changed forever. Tell us a little bit about the diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was living in San Diego at the time, working for a company focused on mobile data analytics, and went in, and I was starting to have a number of fasciculations, which are like muscle cramps, muscle twitching in my arms and legs and shoulders. And that's actually what led me to go seek out a neurologist. And the testing process, unfortunately for ALS, there is no test that tells you that you have ALS. It's really a series of tests that exclude other diseases. So after about 3.5 months of blood work and CAT scans and muscle biopsies, I was at the doctor's office, and that's when he told me, well, sorry to hear that you've got ALS. And the doctor said, my question was, what's next? And he said, well, I recommend that you get your life in order. Because at the time I really didn't know much about ALS. This was before the Ice Bucket Challenge. So once the dust settled with the diagnosis, I found myself kind of in this new paradigm of wanting to figure out a way to track what my progression was going to look like, because the doctors, most of them say every patient's different and only time will tell.
And so can you pause for a moment there and talk a little bit about progression tracking? I know that's a huge part of your life now, and anybody else that's going through this same journey with ALS, and what that progression tracking means specifically to research teams. I'm guessing that you mean that you take a baseline score, for lack of a better term, and then begin measuring changes over time. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, so for progression tracking, there's really two sides to it. Obviously, there's, from my standpoint as a patient, wanting to actually have a better handle on what's going on with the disease. Unfortunately, with ALS, it has an 80% mortality in 2 to 5 years. But not knowing how you're going to progress is quite challenging. So, at its core, what you want to do is try to understand what's happening and allow you to try to anticipate some of those changes in what's going to happen over time.
And that makes sense. And I can imagine, as a professional with a data background, you of all people understand and appreciate the value and the importance of data collection and the data samples that you're able to gather. I can imagine that was particularly frustrating for you, considering how analog the process was before you got to it.
Yeah, when I was diagnosed, there really was no way, and up until we created the app, the doctors use this survey, which is called the ALS-FRS, which stands for Functional Rating Scale. And they've been using this both in a clinical perspective and for researchers doing drug analysis for the past 20 years. And it's a paper-based survey. It's a subjective survey of 12 questions that are used to try to categorize what's happening with your disease. And really with ALS, it's broken down into two main areas. So ALS, or motor neuron disease, as they refer to it in the rest of the world, affects all your voluntary muscles. And it's really broken into two pathways. One is called limb onset, which means it's how is it affecting your arms and your legs and your hands. And the other is bulbular onset. And bulbular onset is affecting your swallowing, your speaking, and your breathing. So it really is kind of two different pathways, but pretty much all patients eventually will cross over from one onset to the other as it affects all of your muscle areas. The challenge with this survey most patients actually only fill out the survey when they go to an ALS multidisciplinary clinic. So you see a group of 5 or 6 different specialists, but you're typically only going to that clinic about every 3 to 4 months. So when you think of that mortality of 80% in 2 to 5 years, that means if you're only filling out this survey 4 times a year, the maximum number of data points or time points that they're tracking is 20 over the typical disease progression pathway. So it really doesn't give you a lot of accuracy or data, on how a given patient is progressing.
So it seems like it specifically in this case, the efficiency in data capture and the amount of data that's captured are very important to ALS research teams. I would imagine that going through this with your technical background, you can kind of find these inefficiencies challenging. I'm sure that's what led you to coming up with a better solution.
Yeah, so, as I said, when I was diagnosed in 2013, I had limb onset, so for me it started in my arms and legs. So the only thing at the time that I could do to try to track, how I was changing was actually, using a fitness tracker like a Fitbit and some apps on my phone that I used to use for rides and hiking to kind of track your distance. But there was no way to really figure out what else was happening. And I was actually attending a 2014 Apple launch event, and they announced a Parkinson's app. And that really was kind of the aha moment for me from a neurological disease perspective, looking at what was done for Parkinson's and then thinking, well, why can't we take this mobile analytics solution and take a mobile phone and apply that and build a mobile app specifically for ALS patients?
And I would imagine the ALS research teams that you were working with were probably pretty receptive to the idea of an app instead of paper-based data collection?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of the folks that I was dealing with were Dr. John Ravitz at UCSD and Dr. Catherine Frintz, who's a neurophysiotherapist at UCSD. So I actually took that concept to them and basically floated around, okay, if we were going to go down this pathway that was done for Parkinson's, how could we adapt that concept specifically into different areas related to ALS that would allow us to actually track disease progression from a number of different angles.
And that's really where FileMaker comes in this story. FileMaker, of course, a low-code, no-code app development platform, allows citizen developers just like yourself to accomplish custom app developments in the fraction of the time with a fraction of the resources typically necessary to pull off similar projects in other app development environments. And that's exactly what you did here. And Steph, I'd like to share the app with everybody to kind of show them how you were able to use the FileMaker platform to do, amongst other things, provide more granular data to research teams, expand your data sets, capture data more frequently, and while making an app that's easier for patients to use than a 12-page paper form. Why don't we dive right into that? You can help me tell people about some of the interesting features of the platform. The first of which really is about you have some FDA requirements that a lot of research teams outside of the ALS community also have to deal with. Is that right?
Yeah, so from a medical research standpoint, the FDA and also something called an IRB, which is an independent review board, require you to do an informed consent. So we actually built the informed consent process, or what we call the e-consent, electronic consent, right into the app itself. So the intention of this is for patients to actually understand the purpose of the research study and how it's going to affect them. So even though this is an observational research study that we've basically created with the app, we still have to go through this informed consent process and make sure they understand what they're agreeing to, how their data is going to be used, where will it exist, and how it will benefit them and benefit others. So we've developed a series of questions to basically capture that understanding.
And this is pretty common with other research that's happening out there as far as collecting data. You do have to make sure that you're compliant with the FDA requirements, I'm assuming.
Yep, yeah, and it's a requirement of the independent review board as well, that you actually go through this process. Otherwise, your study becomes invalidated.
And that's where you also have to make sure that you have a signature on file as part of the compliance, and that's where FileMaker's feature of being able to put a container field on a layout. In this case, you're seeing in FileMaker 16, we're putting an embedded container with the signature capture right on the FileMaker custom app so that the individual filling out the e-consent form on their first time visiting the app can also then sign it right on the touchscreen display and save that for future use in case you ever need to report that back to the FDA.
Yeah, absolutely. It's stored as part of their profile for the clinical study, and in case we get audited.
And so then after that point of going through e-consent, they do their first time filling out of the profile. This is, of course, the information that needs to be protected under the FDA compliance. It's information that is stored here within the app and then transmitted over to research teams. Obviously, a lot better than paper, right, Steph? I mean, the second that they enter this data in, they're already in the centralized repository.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the goal here is to actually, if you look at research studies, there's a research study typically for ALS only has, you know, 100 to 200 patients involved, you know, compared to cancer research, which may have thousands. Our goal is to actually get this app out to every patient, irregardless of whether you're involved in a pharmaceutical study, and potentially become the benchmark and the gold standard for those pharmaceutical studies.
So you're saying having them involved will also make them available for other studies?
Yeah, so we can use the profile actually as part of the criteria in determining whether or not a patient would qualify. So a lot of medical studies, you know, you have to be within 2 years of your diagnosis. You can't be on a tracheotomy yet. Your forced vital capacity or your respiratory has to be at a certain point. So those criteria, we can actually now glean that data, you know, from their profile and from their activities to know where they're at.
And once they filled out their profile, these activities that you referred to earlier, like voice recording and different other types of tracking of information, that can also be handled inside the app. I noticed in addition to using containers for capturing signatures, you're also using them to capture voice recordings, and that's part of progression tracking as well?
Yeah, so you'll notice here in the activities screen, we really broke it down into a couple of different areas to do range of motion, to do motor skills and dexterity, as well as voice recording, which would allow us to actually do that bulbular analysis and voice analysis, or do the limb onset analysis through range of motion.
And then what happens to all the voice recordings after they're captured?
Yep, so we run the voice recordings actually through a series of analysis sequences using some AI, and that actually will create scores on their voice and bulbular progression, as well as respiratory.
And the scores, amongst other data, are some of the things that you want to report back to the research teams. And I see that you're using some of FileMaker's reporting tools here, like, for example, the chart tool. And then right within the app, you're allowing them to share this information with research teams via email?
Yeah, so there's obviously the global research repository, which that data would be available to researchers that's been de-identified. But then, you know, another big benefit is for patients to actually be empowered to take control of their disease and empower their care teams. So we've added some charting right into the app itself so they can create some reports and share it with their personal clinical teams and their care providers as well, to help them stay ahead of that progression scale.
Huge upside there, and FileMaker makes that pretty easy with minimal programming to be able to provide all that functionality. It's really a good mix for this type of thing. In addition to some of the other things that we've been talking about here within the demo, there are some really specific benefits to using FileMaker for something like this, and I think they cross over into other research team usage of the platform. If we take a look at a couple of those, it appears to me that the ease of use and the cost-effective nature of the FileMaker platform were really paramount for you here in this endeavor. Is that correct, Steph?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, again, we're dealing with a patient population which is typically, you know, in the traditionally late 50s to early 60s when your disease onset is. So ease of use with minimal training. Obviously, we don't want to have to train, you know, 30 to 60,000 people on how to use the app and you know, provide research data. So we had to try to go for a zero training goal. And then the other side was on the cost. You know, originally when we started creating the use cases for the app, to develop the solution, I actually started shopping it around to some app development companies to do a custom Xcode or Objective-C app, and I was getting quotes that it was going to take anywhere from 8 to 12 months, and it was going to cost anywhere from $150,000 to $250,000 to develop the first iteration of the app. And for me, obviously, time is of the essence. Every 90 minutes, somebody new is diagnosed with ALS, and every 90 minutes, somebody dies. So we're losing patients and we're gaining patients. So, getting time to market as fast as possible was very important, as well as being able to develop something in a more agile methodology and do multiple iterations to make sure that we hit that ease of use.
Yeah, those seem like really some of the other quotes you got there, maybe some non-starters, but no doubt FileMaker played a huge role in making this all come to fruition. Also, I think there's some benefits associated with being able to store and centralize all this data, and also the breadth of the data that you're allowed to gather. I would imagine these data sample sizes grew pretty significantly as well.
Yeah, so we're looking at actually capturing over 80 data points as compared to the 12-question survey that had 12 data points, and we wanted to capture the data either on a daily or weekly basis, versus 3 to 4 times a year. So obviously the frequency was important, the granularity of the data was important, but also if you think of the current research standards, each individual research study becomes a data silo. So in this case, now we've actually broadened the scope, from a typical 150 patients to upwards of tens of thousands. If we hit the entire ALS population worldwide, there'd be 60,000 participants actually participating in the research, and would be eliminating those data silos. So it's probably the first global research study that potentially would impact every patient.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. The ceiling here on this is pretty enormous. So really, we look at FileMaker allowing you to be able to provide more granular data to research teams, expand those data sets like you've been talking about, capture data more frequently, which apparently seems to be a huge upside here, all while making an app that was easier for patients in the target demo to use, something even more easy to use and more self-explanatory than a 12-page paper form. And Steph, I just want to give you a chance to let people know where they can learn more about the ALS Never Surrender and your efforts as well.
Sure. Yeah, they can go to the alsneversurrender.org website, and then also a couple of social sharing hashtags, hashtag science not surveys, and hashtag every patient every time. So where you can find out about the app release. And we're also not only looking for patients, but we're also looking at non-affected individuals to provide that baseline data to compare against as well. So we hope to get quite a broad number of users.
Well, Steph, it's really been a pleasure for me to be able to work with you on this, and I think everybody really feels how powerful this story is, and we all appreciate that you've taken time out to help tell it today. And we all thank you very much. And of course, for those of you that are interested in what next steps you might take, interested in how to use maybe FileMaker for your own research projects, let's go back to Ryan for some more information on some next steps.
Thank you, Chris and Steph, for sharing your story and your custom app with us. Like Chris said, this is a really, really powerful example of what can be achieved to streamline processes when working with time-sensitive data and using an agile development platform like FileMaker. And I also want to point out that it's a really fantastic example of the FileMaker community of users and developers collaborating together to make something truly amazing. So again, thank you so much to the both of you. So again, now that we've seen these use cases, where do we go from here? Let's talk about some next steps after this webinar. Head on over to FileMaker.com, where we'll have an upcoming section dedicated to research teams where you can gain further information about the case studies we talked about today, along with additional customer stories similar to yours. And then while you're on FileMaker.com, make sure to download a trial of FileMaker Pro and get started tackling your own custom app. And if you're not sure how to begin building your own custom app, or you want to brush up on the fundamentals of the FileMaker platform, FileMaker's Custom App Academy is the perfect resource to review. It's mainly video-based tutorials covering easy-to-follow lessons tailored to your level, so you'll walk through building your first custom app while learning best practices and methodologies along the way. And don't forget to join the FileMaker community forums. It's free to join, and not only can you ask as many questions as you want and interact with the FileMaker developer community as much as you want, but you'll also get access to a ton of free content such as technical briefs, how-to articles, and videos like recorded sessions from FileMaker's annual developer conference. So the community is another fantastic free resource at your disposal. All right, then with that, let's go ahead and jump into some Q&A. If you haven't asked a question already, head on over to the GoToWebinar control panel, click on the question section, enter your question, and click on send. All right, to start it off, the first question, Steph and Chris, can you talk about how long it took to build the first beta of the app?
Sure. We started the actual coding and the creation of the app solution back in September, October of last year, and we had our first beta available for testing in December. So it was about 3.5 months, and we actually did a couple of iterations on the UI to try to nail that down. And then we've done a secondary beta, and we're getting ready to do a final quite shortly here as well, waiting for this next iOS update just to make sure that we're everything's running good.
And was Apple's Research Kit considered as an option before you went the FileMaker route?
It was. We actually did look at Research Kit because that's what the part of the Parkinson's app was based on. But the challenge with Research Kit is then we needed an Xcode developer, which wasn't something that we had readily available. And I was actually able to do most of the development work for the solution myself, and I don't know how to program an Xcode. So we selected FileMaker as a more end-to-end solution for us that gave us both the mobile component, because we are deploying it on the phone and using some custom Xcode for sensor integration. Mm-hmm. But then we also needed the cloud side of things. We needed that central repository, and if we went with another solution, we would have to develop an entire back-end platform as well.
Excellent. A question about how analysis is handled in your custom app. Do you do it directly in FileMaker, or do you export the data and perform analysis in like a third-party analysis software?
Yeah, so the analysis is actually going to be done third-party. We've actually teamed up with a couple of organizations. One of them is Origin Data Sciences out of DC, and they've actually done a lot of regression analysis on top of prior clinical trial data. So they're actually going to be performing some of that data analysis for us. And then also we'll have the de-identified data available to research teams, so they'll be able to use whatever research platform that they choose from and run it across that scrubbed export data set.
Perfect. All right, so we have a question about handling users who not consistently enter their data. Do you have anything built into the workflow, like sending reminders to the users to enter their data, or any other type of method to handle that?
Yeah, we've looked at the reminder question. We haven't implemented anything specific for it yet. We do have obviously their email contact information as part of their profile. So we're probably going to start off with an email notification reminder off of the centralized data, and then look at some other notification integration later on as well.
All right, and a question about the architecture of this deployment. Is this something you see deployed on FileMaker Cloud or FileMaker Server?
Yeah, we're deploying it in Amazon and the FileMaker Cloud because we need that scalability to be able to scale their servers. And obviously, our foundation, the foundation itself is almost entirely volunteers, so we're trying to keep it as cost-effective as possible.
And do you have to have a iPhone to use this app?
Currently, with the integration that we've developed for the sensors, we're looking at both the iPhones and the iPod Touches. So we've developed the components to actually run on both of those. And then longer term, we're actually going to look at supporting other devices. But it is primarily because we're measuring motion and measuring range of motion. You know, they need something that they can hold in their hand to be able to do those motion tests.
And can you talk about if you met any resistance from an IT team, if you had to go through a IT team, and how you kind of flip that into them accepting the FileMaker platform as a viable resource?
Yeah, we didn't have any resistance from IT because, you know, it's our foundation, so we were able to set the goals and set the standards. So, you know, that's the great thing, I guess, about being the CEO of the foundation is you get to decide what path you're going to take.
Perfect. And can you talk about, as a next step, is this something that you're looking to deploy strictly as an app within FileMaker Go, or would you leverage something like the FileMaker iOS SDK and turn this into its own app?
We actually are using the FileMaker SDK. So it is going to be deployed primarily through an MDM solution, and the reasoning for that is we have what I would consider its sister app. That is the Xcode component to do the motion testing that passes the data back to FileMaker. So FileMaker becomes our central repository for all the data entry, as well as through the secondary app that we've developed. So we'll have to deploy 2 apps out to the mobile devices through an MDM.
Perfect. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. On behalf of Chris and Steph, and on behalf of FileMaker, it was our absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Definitely hope you enjoyed the webinar, and definitely hope you see you on another webinar soon. Have a fantastic day, everyone.